The Subcommittee on Indian and Insular Affairs will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess of the Subcommittee at any time. The Subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the President's FY 2025 budget request for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Indian Health Service, and Office of Insular Affairs. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the Chairman and the ranking minority member. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted in accordance with Committee Rule 3(0). Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Stansberry, be allowed to sit and participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. The Subcommittee is meeting today to examine the President's FY 2025 budget request for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or BIA, the Indian Health Service, or IHS, and the Office of Insular Affairs, OIA. Under the Constitution, Congress has the responsibility to tax and spend wisely, making decisions on how best to prioritize the finite federal resources. It is also Congress's job to provide oversight of how federal funds are spent by agencies and their prioritization of programs and policies. The BIA is responsible for honoring the U.S.'s treaty and trust responsibilities towards American Indians and Alaska Natives. The President's FY 2025 budget requests $2.9 billion in discretionary funding for the BIA. Additionally, the budget proposes that tribal leases and contract support costs be reclassified as mandatory spending beginning in 2026, bypassing the appropriations process from that point on. The BIA administers 56 million surface acres and 59 million acres of subsurface mineral estates held in trust by the United States for the benefit individual American Indians or tribes. The President's budget continues to focus on conservation and climate change programs that can limit tribal access to natural resource development on tribal lands. History has shown that we can balance conservation and resource development. Tribes have the knowledge and the experience to make it work, and BIA should be supportive of all efforts of self-determination. Turning to health care, the IHS is the primary agency charged with providing medical services to Native people, such as primary care, emergency services, and substance abuse care. The President's budget requests $8.2 billion and proposes moving all budgetary authority for the agency to mandatory spending starting in FY 2026. I think many would agree that there needs to be continued oversight and accountability of IHS. There continues to be concerns with the agency's ability to provide adequate care and the efficiency of the purchase and referred care program. Concerns also remain regarding the Indian Health Facility's construction list, as it has yet to be completed and costs for these projects have ballooned. The average IHS hospital is 39 years old, which is 3 times the age of an average U.S. hospital. The President's budget does not include any innovative proposals to address this ongoing issue. Additionally, questions remain regarding the hiring and retention of IHS medical and support personnel, how to best care for individuals suffering from substance abuse and mental health disorders. Lastly, the OIA is charged with carrying out the responsibilities for the U.S. insular areas of American Samoa, Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, as well as managing and in administering the implementation of the Compacts of Free Association, or COFA. OIA's budget shows an overall $9.62 million decrease in discretionary funding. However, This decrease is attributable to the expiration of the previous COFA agreements. If we look at the non-COFA related spending, the OIA budget request is actually increasing discretionary funding by $2.44 million. I hope the testimony from our OIA witness today will clearly explain why the OIA has requested this increase and how they calculated these costs. I'd like to stress that Congress will continue to oversee OIA's implementation of COFA. We will not stand idly by, and we will ensure that all provisions are carried out in the manner that Congress intended. I would also like to remind the OIA of its responsibility to facilitate and coordinate the work of the Interagency Group on Freely Associated States. I urge the Department to be transparent and communicate timely with Congress on the status of COFA implementation. Energy security and reliability are of crucial concern for the insular areas. I want to ensure that the Department advances insular economic opportunity and self-determination to increase energy reliability and affordability. In general, the federal government has increased spending over the last decade, leading to a higher deficit and an increased worry for our nation's fiscal future. It is important that this committee continues to provide oversight of the BIA, IHS, and OIA to ensure they are fulfilling their missions effectively in a fiscally responsible manner and for the benefit of those they serve. I want to thank the witnesses for being with us today. The chair now recognizes the ranking minority member for any statement.
Thank you so very much, Madam Chair, for your opening statement, and thank you so very much to the witnesses for being here with us today on the budget request for the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Office of Insular Affairs and the Indian Health Service. This subcommittee has held 16 hearings this Congress discussing a wide range of issues and legislation that impacts Indian country. We held a hearing on public safety in tribal communities and heard the consequences suffered by Native Americans from the lack of tribal law enforcement officers. In many cases, only a few tribal officers there are only a few tribal officers to patrol hundreds of miles to keep their communities safe. And too often, we hear that tribes must use their own funds to make up the funding shortfalls from Congress. In response, our committee passed the Parity for Tribal Law Enforcement Act. This is a very important bill, but to actually make a difference and to have the parity work, we need to actually provide the funding so that we can get to parity. We need to make sure we appropriate the money to pay the salaries to hire officers, to purchase the needed patrol vehicles and other equipment. When we hear about priorities, I believe it is a priority. In fact, one of the most urgent priorities, given our trust responsibility to Indian tribes to fund the solutions to the problems we've heard about in this committee room. For example, we recently heard about purchased and referred care services at the Indian Health Service and how the IHS needs to improve. But let's look at the funding numbers. The Indian Health Service's per capita expenditure per person was only $4,078 in fiscal year 2019, compared to the U.S. national health expenditure of $9,726 per person. That means that tribal citizens are seeing less than half the investment for their health. And I want to remind everybody and myself that we have taken on a trust responsibility and obligation to provide that health care. It was part of the promise we made in exchange for everything that the United States has received from the first Americans. It is unacceptable. This chart tells it all. It shows the fact that for urban Indians, it's even worse, $672. So these highlight a common theme across all the hearings we've had in this committee room this year and a half. Stories from tribal leaders illustrating that Congress needs to be doing more to uphold our trust responsibility. Even when we heard about the benefits tribes see from 638 contracts and compacts to the 477 workforce program at the BIA, it was coupled with agencies only having 1 or 2 staff to handle hundreds of applications. Undersecretary, you shared the increase, Deputy Secretary, you shared the increase in the requested self-determination contracts that you're seeing, but you have not increased the number of people to process that. And while we continually hear the benefits communities are seeing from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, I want to recognize that the bulk of the work mandated by these laws was sent to the Department of Interior, including the BIA. I know that you are all working, processing more. I know that you are all working because we need to do more and do the kind of oversight and fixing the problems that aren't about funding, but are about responsiveness and communication and transparency. That you must do. But we will also need to couple that with the resources you need. The Indian Health Service and Bureau of Indian Affairs will see under your budget a 16% and 18% increase in your budgets. This is a welcome increase, but we know it's not enough. Congress must do more when it comes to resources for Indian country. Turning to the budget for our fellow U.S. citizens in the insular areas. The insular areas might be seen as small, isolated, and dependent on 1 or 2 main sources of income. But in our travels there, we understand and we recognize the important role they play for America, America's national security, and our identity in the Blue Continent. The insular areas are also on the front lines of the impacts of our changing climate, facing catastrophic hurricanes, typhoons, almost annually. In many of the islands, federal programs are a major source of government revenues. According to the Office of Insular Affairs statistics, federal funds are 20% of the U.S. Virgin Islands government income, 33% in Guam, 34% in the Mariana Islands, and 65% in the American Samoa. Yet, despite these facts, the budget for the Office of Insular Affairs has remained constant for the past decade. It is my hope that starting with today's hearing, we can, on a bipartisan basis, explore ways to ensure that adequate resources are provided to OIA to enable them to address the unique, important challenges that are faced by some of the most vulnerable members of our American family. Once again, thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Thank you for the work that you do for tribes in the insular areas. And I want to, again, go back to the theme of recognizing that you and your staff are processing more and more requests without a substantial increase in funding. And I'd like to remind myself and my colleagues that of the importance of funding these programs, because unlike any other federal agencies, we have a trust responsibility to Native Americans because they don't have any other sources of funding. So we will take that into account. I look forward to hearing from you. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Now I will introduce our witnesses for our panel. The Honorable Bryan Newland, Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, Department of the Interior, Washington, D.C. The Honorable Carmen Cantor, Assistant Secretary for Insular and International Affairs, Office of Insular Affairs, Department of the Interior, Washington, D.C. The Honorable Rosalind So, Director, Indian Health Service, Department of Health and Human Services, Rockville, Maryland. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, please press the talk button on the microphone. We use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. When you have 1 minute left, the light will turn yellow. And at the end of 5 minutes, the light will turn red, and I will ask you to please complete your statement. I will also allow all witnesses on the panel to testify before member questioning. The chair now recognizes the Honorable Bryan Newland for 5 minutes.